Good morning and welcome to this webinar on modern slavery, Is Your Bank Protected? Presented by Fintelekt Academy in partnership with the Mekong Club. Modern slavery, as you may know, is an umbrella term encompassing a range of human rights violations and impacts virtually every industry in every country in the world. Even though this is illegal globally, there are an estimated 40 million plus victims across the globe, 1 in 4 of which are children. And this also means that 1 in every 200 people approximately alive are in some way victims of modern slavery. With modern slavery generating an estimated 150 billion US dollars, this also makes the crime amongst the top 3 in the world, generating illegal proceeds, with the first two, as you know, being drug trafficking and illicit trade or trade-based money laundering. The Mekong Club is an anti-slavery NGO that works positively and collaboratively with the private sector to combat modern slavery across industries. And we are delighted that they have agreed to share their experience and expertise today to help banks and financial institutions better understand how to effectively identify and mitigate modern slavery risk in their operations and ultimately eradicate this crime by making it unprofitable for the perpetrators involved. As I read in a recent report, the profits of modern slavery are privatized through money laundering, but the cost is borne by society. And in a way, this represents a failure by various parties, the government, the regulators, the labor markets, the law enforcement agencies, intelligence agencies, and the financial sector, who have yet to demonstrate a wholehearted will to stop this menace. Now, most of us in this webinar today are from the financial sector, and we know that while the financial sector on its own cannot end modern slavery, it is also true that without the efforts of the financial sector, this problem will not go away unless the financial sector does something about it. Because it's a sector that has the maximum influence and leverage over what happens in the world economically. At a national level, it is extremely important that human trafficking or modern slavery is flagged off as a risk in the national risk assessment of every country. Because if it isn't, then none of the sectors within the country will actually recognize it as a risk, and the regulators will not mandate reporting entities to take this seriously. And at the institutional level, it is critical that we as compliance officers and senior management members in banks and financial institutions make it an important part of our enterprise-wide risk assessment so that we build processes, systems, and risk identification methods to actually flag off suspicious transactions related to modern slavery to the FIU of our respective countries. I'm delighted to welcome our two speakers to the webinar today, Matt Friedman and Phoebe Ewan of the Mekong Club based in Hong Kong. Matt will make opening remarks to set the stage, and then we will have Phoebe making a detailed presentation on the subject. Let me first say a few words about them. In the spirit of ladies first, Phoebe Ewan is Program Director at the Mekong Club. She manages the design, implementation, and monitoring of anti-slavery programs, covering industries from financial services to supply chain management. She also coordinates strategic planning at Mekong Club, developing relationships and collaborations across countries and industries, and to further the collective goal of ending modern slavery. Previously, Phoebe worked in anti-money laundering for a global financial service provider in a role that comprised developing comprehensive AML strategies, risk assessment methodologies, and training programs within the commercial banking sector. A little bit about Matt. Matt is an international human trafficking expert, very well recognized in the community. But for those of you who do not know him yet, he is CEO of the Mekong Club. Earlier, from 2006 to 2012, he was the regional project manager of the United Nations Interagency Project on Human Trafficking in Thailand, which is an interagency body that links the United Nations system with governments and civil society groups in China, Cambodia, Laos, PDR, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam. And even before that, from 91 to 2006, Matt worked for the United States Agency for International Development in Thailand, Bangladesh, and Nepal. So Matt and Phoebe, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the opportunity. What I'm going to do is to just jump into my talk. And what I'm going to do is set the stage for talking a little bit about what is human trafficking in general, the relationship of human trafficking to the private sector, and then how it relates to the banks. And then Phoebe is going to switch over to talking about an assessment tool that we use across Asia, basically to help banks understand what they need to do in order to address modern slavery. So to begin with, when most people think about human trafficking, this is what they think about: forced prostitution, for good reason. There are 4.2 million women and girls in forced prostitution around the world. My first exposure to this topic was about 30 years ago. I was living and working in Nepal. I was a public health officer, and my job was to translate resources into healthier people. What we were finding was that there were girls 12, 13 years old who were HIV positive, and we couldn't understand what was going on. As you all know, Nepal is a very conservative culture. So we went to go and interview the girls, and what we heard was basically the same story over and over again. And it went something like this: human trafficker would go into the community, flash a bunch of money around, and say, "I'm looking for a wife. Don't want an urban wife, I want a rural wife." He'd find a girl, 12, 13 years old, befriend her, then go to the families and say, "I'd like to marry your daughter." The family would say, "Wow, he's rich, he's famous, he's handsome, he's basically going to take care of our daughter, he's going to take care of us." They say yes. A couple of days later, they actually go through a wedding ceremony. After that, he goes to the family and says, "I'm going to take your daughter to Kathmandu, but don't worry, I'll be back in 3 months." But that isn't what's going to happen. Instead of going to Kathmandu, he takes her to Mumbai, India, to the red light district. He puts her in a room and he says, "Honey, stay here, I'll be back in a few minutes." As she was coming in, she saw these women and men milling around. She said, No, don't leave me here, I'm afraid." He says, "It's okay, I'll be right back." He then goes to the madam to collect the $500 for having sold her to the brothel. He has the gold from the wedding, and he hands the wedding pictures over. He then leaves to go back to Nepal to do this again and again, maybe 40, 50 times in a year. The madam then goes into the room where the girl is and says, "Guess what? Your husband sold you to me, and you're going to be with 20 guys a day, every day, because I say so." You can imagine her shock. No, my husband loves me. No, that's what happens. When the girls come to internalize this, many of them say, "I'll kill myself before I do those shameful things." The madam then takes out the wedding photos and says, "Is this your mom, your dad, your brother? If you hurt yourself, we'll hurt them." So she's trapped in this situation. In order to become a prostitute, you simply shame her. So they bring in a couple of professional rapists, and over a 2-day period of time, they rape this girl maybe 30 times until eventually she just lays back and accepts whatever happens to her. After that, she's put on to the line, which means that she'll be with 20 guys a day, every day, until after a couple of years, when she gets what's called black eye, they throw her out onto the street. Now, I was hearing this story over and over again, but I didn't understand the evil of it until I actually went to those brothels. The Indian government invited me to do public health checks. I was with a police officer, went into one of the brothels, and there was an 11-year-old trafficking victim. This girl saw me, saw an opportunity, literally ran up and wrapped herself around me and said, "Save me, save me. They're doing terrible things to me." I turned to the police officer and said, "We need to get this girl out." He said, "We can't do that." I said, "What are you talking about? You're a cop." He says, "If we try to leave, they'll kill us both." To make a long story short, we left. We came back with a lot of police, but of course she was gone. Now, I tell this story because I wasn't one of those 15-year-olds that said when I grow up, I want to be an activist. In fact, I did everything I could not to be. But every once in a while in life, we're faced with a test. My test was to get her out of there. I failed miserably. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. And I did what a lot of activists do. I surrendered to the fact that now that I know about this, this is what I'm going to do with my life. And 30 years later, here I am talking to you. But it's not just women and girls. The fishing boat that you see here, the story behind that, 15-year-old boy from Cambodia is told by his family, "You have to go to Thailand, get a job, send money home." He goes to Thailand looking around for work, not finding it. Eventually, a trafficker sees this, goes up to him and says, "Hey, brother, you're from Cambodia, I'm from Cambodia. Let me give you a hand. Let me lend you some money." "Okay, well, now that you have my money, you have to stay with me, but guess what? I have this great job. I'm going to take you down to the ocean. I'm going to put you on a boat. The boat will go out for a couple of months. You'll come back. You have all this money in your pocket. You'll be a real hero." They go down to the ocean. He gets onto the boat. He doesn't realize he's been sold onto the boat. The boat goes out, but it doesn't come back after 3 months. It stays out there for 4 years. This poor kid will end up working 14, 15, 16 hours a day, every day. If he doesn't, he gets beaten, he gets tortured. The only food he'll eat the entire time he's there is rice and fish, nothing nutritious. They give him drugs in order to stimulate his body to work hard. If he gets ill, if he gets injured, they throw him off the side of the boat. At the end of the 4 years, boat comes in, the guy goes to the captain and says, give me something. Captain says, go away, you're illegally in my country. Guy says, I'm going to tell the police what you did. Captain says, go ahead, we own the police. This is another example of human trafficking. Now, I don't have time to go into the other examples, but you see, we have agriculture, we have cocoa, we have construction, we have sweatshops. There are many different types of human trafficking that exist out there, and many that are found all over the world. So about 19% of them would be sex trafficking. The other 81% would be forced labor. But out of this, 64% of these cases are associated with supply chains. About 16 million people around the world working in private sector settings that are tainted by modern slavery. When it comes to the global figures, there are about 40 million people in modern slavery around the world. In fact, there are more slaves today than any other time in history. About 9.2 million people enter per year, about 25,200 per day, and about 66% of them are in Asia, basically for two reasons. Number one, Asia has huge populations. Look at China, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, Japan. All of those countries have relatively large populations. Second, you have feudal systems that still exist across Asia that have never been completely dismantled. To just offer one of the figures, in India, it's estimated that there's close to 8 million people in what's called modern slavery. When it comes to who's supposed to address the issue, well, it's supposed to be governments, and most governments do something, but not enough to really make that much of a significant difference. A lot of governments in Southeast Asia don't like this topic. It's embarrassing to basically have slavery in Hong Kong and China and Vietnam and Thailand and Singapore and the UK and Australia. And so things happen, but not nearly enough to make a difference. I worked for the United Nations for 6 years. I will put my hand on my heart when I say this. I believe in the United Nations system, but I spent a lot of time in five-star hotels, eating really good food, talking about poverty. There was a real disconnect between what I was supposed to be doing and what I was actually doing. So it's the non-government organizations that do most of the heavy lifting in this sector. But if we go back to the statistics again, out of 40 million people, 81% in forced labor and 64% of them in supply chains, there's somebody else that needs to be involved in this, the private sector. But if you think governments don't like this topic, the private sector hates it because they're often on the receiving end of people saying that the private sector is so greedy that they would actually use slaves for shareholder profits. Now, in reality, most large branded companies are responsible. They would do anything they could not to have exploitation in their system, but it's not always easy to find it because sometimes it's very low in their supply chains. But consumers feel that this is the way the private sector is. When it comes to how many people are helped each year out of modern slavery, it's about 0.2%. So this means that with all of the governments and the NGOs and the United Nations and everybody working together, we're not even hitting 0.5%. And out of 500,000 criminals, about 7,000 are put in jail, or 0.9%. Now, if you look at this, you might ask, is the counter-trafficking world lazy? Are they not doing their job? That's not the issue. The issue is this: the prophet says we're indicated are about 150 billion US dollars a year, second only or third only to other transnational crimes like counterfeiting and drug trafficking. The amount of money that's used to address this issue is about $350 million, or 0.23% of the profits. That means that we have a huge amount of money that is being earned by people who don't have to follow rules and regulations and laws, and the people who have to basically go after this don't have the resources to make all that much of a difference. Another thing is the number of criminals out there is about 500,000. The number of people like myself that do work on this full time is about 20,000. And so you can see what we're up against. And lastly, awareness related to modern slavery is very low in every sector. Anywhere I go, whether it's a bank or a corporation or private sector, faith-based, or even students, and I talk about this topic, most people don't know much about it. As a result, if you don't know anything about a topic, you're not going to care. If you don't care, you're not going to do anything. When it comes to COVID, we're anticipating that the numbers of people in modern slavery will go up significantly, partly because if you don't have a paycheck coming in and you're sent home and you have limited savings, you'll eventually go through your savings, you'll eventually borrow money, and if you can't pay that money back, oftentimes the loan sharks will say, I need a family member to come with me for a year to work in this situation to pay off the debt. So we anticipate there will be significant increases in modern slavery as a result of this. And what I'd like to do now is to talk a little bit about the relevance of this to the private sector. 10 years ago, most banks would have no interest or no understanding of this topic because there was very little relevance. But the private sector's involvement in this happened around that time. And so a number of things happened because when governments came to realize that the NGOs were only able to help about 0.2% of the victims, and that many of the victims were associated with the private sector, they said we have to get the private sector involved. So they set up things that created what I would describe a business risk. So the first trend that we saw is in 2012, the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act was put in place. And it basically says if you're a big company and you have any products in California, you have to put on your website what you're doing to address modern slavery. If you're not doing anything at all and you say that, you're in compliance, but you have to say something. This legislation is called transparency legislation, and it allows consumers to see what companies are doing. A couple of years later, the UK Modern Slavery Act came into play. It did the same thing, but it added 2 more components. An annual report that describes what you're doing to address it, and that has to be signed by the board of directors. And we're seeing additional legislation coming into play in Germany, in Holland, in Canada that will have fines and penalties. In addition, we're seeing lawsuits against major retailers that say, for instance, Tesco were to buy seafood from Thailand. It's considered to be potentially tainted by modern slavery, and so they're being sued for supporting that supply chain. In one case, the plaintiff wanted on the side of the tuna fish there to be a label that said this product could be tainted by modern slavery. Not a good thing to have on the side of your product. We're seeing significant increases in modern slavery, a doubling every year for the last 5 years because people are really interested in the topic. And lastly, ESG, which is the do-gooder kind of metric that is used by the private sector to address whether they're doing the right thing. Oftentimes you had the environmental and the governance indicators very well established, but the social ones, which would include modern slavery, haven't been articulated. What's happening is teachers in Canada are saying, well, how do we know that our investment funds aren't supporting modern slavery? And as a result of that, what we're seeing is more of an emphasis on this metric, having modern slavery indicators be brought into it. If you don't do certain things, it can result in naming and shaming, it can result in boycotts, bad things happen within companies. So why should the banks care about this issue? Well, it really comes back to this number here, 150 billion US dollars a year. That's a tremendously large number. And if you put this into any of your currencies, you can imagine how much bigger this number becomes. If you as a bank have any of that money get into it and anyone finds out about it, the regulators, then it's money laundering. And we're seeing that there are a number of financial institutions that have been hit big. One institution in Australia, $1.3 billion fine. Another institution in the United States, about $65 million. And we're seeing more and more of that type of thing taking place. Obviously, if this happens, it creates reputational risk, loss of investment, loss of confidence in the bank, and so forth. So what was kind of a marginal risk 5, 8, 10 years ago is now becoming front and center because many, many organizations recognize that they have to address this, and if they don't, something bad can happen to them. What we're seeing here in Southeast Asia is a lot of emphasis on a banking response, and one of the first things that happens is typologies are developed. These typologies basically take the criminal activity, break them into component parts, then identify the transactions that take place along the way. And a certain number of the transactions would be identified as red flags. These would be indicators of transactions that could result in human trafficking. And so what's often done is they take those indicators and they put them, they do searches to determine whether or not patterns exist. A perfect example of this would be in the United States, there was a nail salon chain that had hours from 9 in the morning until 9 o'clock at night. They were seeing transactions from this particular organization 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, all around $200. And so when they did further investigation, they came to realize there was a sex trafficking ring in the same business. So the red flag would be transactions after hours all around a particular level. There are many other indicators that are out there. We, on a regular basis, train organizations on these indicators. And lastly, eventually, once you get these indicators refined, you can then search your big data to determine whether or not you have cases or not. When it comes to other sectors that are really concerned about this issue, and the banks need to be concerned about them as well if they finance them with letters of credits or loans or anything else, is the manufacturing sector. Manufacturers have supply chains. Many supply chains have 3 or 4 tiers. Most companies know what's happening on tier 1 where you assemble something. But when you get into the lower levels of the tiers, they don't really know what's happening at that level. They haven't been asked to do it, but the legislation now requires that they do. And as a result of that, there's vulnerability. And an investigative journalist could find something, it could make it into a paper, this could create a big scandal. When it comes to the retailers, as I mentioned, there's a lot of lawsuits against them. Most of the lawsuits haven't been won up until now, but the plaintiffs keep refining what they're doing and how they do it, and this will eventually result in there being fines and penalties that they'll have to pay large amounts. And lastly, the hospitality industry has a number of vulnerabilities as well. Sex trafficking, and in the United States, hotels are being sued. If a 14-year-old girl was used in a hotel and she remembers the hotel and she includes it in a lawsuit, the hotel can be sued for negligence because they didn't protect the girl, even though they maybe had no idea what was happening, but those lawsuits are being won. And as a result of that, insurance companies are not insuring certain hotels anymore because they're afraid they will have to pick up the bill. You also have supply chains, third-party contracts with workers and construction. So all of these have vulnerability. So I'm going to stop there and basically hand it over to Phoebe, who's going to go into more detail about kind of the baseline survey that we're running here in Southeast Asia that we started last year. With that, go ahead, Phoebe, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Sharish and team, for having us today. So I am going to introduce to you a tool that the Mekong Club has developed and that we are making available to anybody on the call today that is interested in participating. And this is the Modern Slavery Baseline Assessment. So to give you guys a bit more background in terms of how the Mekong Club actually operates as an organization, we are an NGO, but we work with private sector organizations in a kind of business association model. So we have a number of multinational companies that we regularly convene into working groups, covering finance companies, hospitality companies, retailers, and manufacturers. We have regular conversations with these organizations to really understand what the challenges and opportunities are within their industries as a whole, not just within their own organization, to better identify and combat issues of modern slavery and human trafficking. So the baseline assessment tool that we're talking to you about today is one of these tools that we've developed through consultations with many different finance companies. And they really highlighted to us, you know, the fact that when you listen to Matt speak, when you read about this issue of modern slavery, it's quite overwhelming and it's quite kind of hard to know where to begin as a company when it comes to effectively developing a strategy to fight this crime, to protect your business from this risk, but also to show leadership in this space. So the baseline assessment has been developed to address this. Now, the assessment itself is essentially a self-assessment questionnaire. So it's a confidential process. It's designed to be very much an internal self-assessment process. It's a list of questions that you essentially ask yourself within your company in order to assess your anti-slavery strategy. So to really understand where your company stands in terms of all of the various different areas that activity needs to be taking place in to really be effectively combating this crime. So it allows you in a very safe way, in a very confidential way, the information that is input into the questionnaire and the information that's shared between ourselves and with the people filling out the questionnaire is kept completely confidential, allows you to understand where you stand right now. It allows you to understand which areas within, say, your bank's anti-slavery strategy you're really succeeding in. So there might be areas around training, for example, that you hadn't really thought about before that you should be reporting more on and kind of highlighting more on within your anti-slavery policies or your strategies or your statements. It also allows you to identify which areas maybe could use more attention. So as I'm sure you gathered during Matt's talk, this is such a wide issue that spans so many different areas of a bank. It can be quite challenging to figure out where the kind of gaps are and where the risks lie. So this gap analysis piece allows you to identify where there could be potential more action to be taken. Now, along with that as well, because we understand it's only so useful to identify those gaps, it's also really necessary to receive very practical solutions, practical recommendations in terms of how to address these gaps, how to improve those areas where potentially more could be done. We also will give you some kind of indication once you complete the self-assessment process in terms of how you compare to industry standards. So the whole process is completely confidential, but we can kind of explain to you, you know, in line with legislation, in line with standards of industries within finance across the world, roughly where you sit, what you could potentially do in order to improve and rise to the top within your industry in this space. So in terms of the questionnaire itself, it's a set of questions. It totals around 30 questions. Some of them are yes, no type answers. Others require a little bit more information. All of the questions answered are completely optional. We understand that banks are very big places. I've worked in finance myself. I understand it can be quite challenging to get everybody in the room and get everybody communicating, especially on such a broad topic of modern slavery. But we've found through implementing this questionnaire with a lot of our partner financial institutions that it's actually encouraged a conversation about this across different silos within the bank. So maybe you'd have your risk teams even speaking to your ESG investment teams, speaking to senior leadership, speaking to procurement. It allows the bringing together of all of these different elements. And we have broken out the questions, the 30 or so questions within the questionnaire into these 5 broad assessment areas. So I'm going to walk you through each of these areas and give you just a couple of examples of the kinds of questions that we ask as part of the assessment process, as well as a couple of examples of the kinds of support that we offer as a result of asking these questions. So the first area is awareness raising. So as I'm sure you can understand, building an effective anti-slavery strategy really starts at the very beginning with raising awareness internally of this issue. You guys are all here on the call today. I'm sure you learned some things when Matt was speaking, and I'm sure even listening to him speak really makes you feel like you want to go and do something to help with this cause. So raising awareness internally within the bank is super, super important generally. And then, of course, really, really important amongst those teams that have special responsibilities related to modern slavery. So think about your risk assessment teams, or your anti-money laundering teams, or even your procurement teams. Each of these teams have different responsibilities. And in order to ensure that they're really taking the right steps, we would suggest that training and awareness raising is really the kind of fundamental building block to this. So as part of the assessment, we have a few questions specific to this topic. We examine how staff are trained on the topic of modern slavery, as well as how specialist teams are trained, amongst other questions. And in terms of those kind of recommendations that we might make off the back of the answers to these questions, we can make recommendations such as giving access to the Mekong Club e-learning platform that includes many different short videos on the topic of modern slavery that can easily be circulated, all the way through to even jumping on a webinar like this and speaking to senior leadership or speaking to specialist teams within the bank, and providing awareness raising talks even in person, maybe one day post-COVID. The next key area within the assessment looks at the bank's risk assessment processes and risk mitigation processes. So of course, as an organization, if you're looking to mitigate risk of modern slavery, either within your client book, within your investment book, within your procurement decisions, you need to understand where the risk lies in order to understand how to address that risk. So we ask questions around how modern slavery risk is actually incorporated into your kind of standard due diligence onboarding type processes, or regular due diligence CDD type processes, all the way through to how risk is even incorporated into your kind of ethical investments, ESG investments, this kind of thing. So just to reiterate this, the assessment is really designed to span across all banking operations. It's not just your retail or your commercial or your investment. And then in terms of the recommendations we can give in this space, we can certainly support with advising on data sources that can help make smarter risk assessment methodologies. And we have sets of ESG indicators, this kind of thing, to further assist with your risk assessments. Now, as Matt mentioned, investigations and typologies are, of course, a really important part of combating this crime. So Matt mentioned the nail salon example. We help you to understand how typologies are currently being used internally, whether modern slavery terms are being used in negative news screenings, transactions monitoring systems, et cetera, and we can also support post-assessment with providing our own typologies on top of those that you already have, and kind of working with you to ensure that systems such as negative news include all of the recommended keywords, for example. Now, another area that the assessment covers that may be less obvious if you're kind of more of an AML professional would be that of procurement and suppliers. So banks have their own supply chains. If you have offices, you might have cleaning staff, you might have maintenance staff that are employed within those offices that are third-party subcontracted staff. So the bank might not have direct oversight on their working conditions. And this is a really interesting area of risk to explore. So we have some questions around how modern slavery risk is applied to procuring those kind of suppliers, how this risk is addressed. And of course, we are able to support with the follow-up around training, around wordings, with codes of conduct and onboarding procedures within the procurement and supply chain side of things. And finally, in terms of the content areas, we have industry leadership as a final area. So we understand that you guys want to protect your businesses, you want to kind of make sure all of the building blocks are there in place to have an effective strategy. But we also at the Mekong Club really like to encourage companies to demonstrate industry leadership in this space. This is a trend that is not going away. There's increasing legislation in this space, and we like to work with companies to really show that banks can lead in the fight against modern slavery. So partnering with us on this is a great way to start. So finally, just to sum up why this process is important and why we're so keen for you guys on the call today to get involved and take on the banking baseline assessment with us. Of course, there's money laundering dangers in every country in the world. Modern slavery continues to be a $150 billion plus crime. And we're really keen to identify more effective ways to fight this. There's of course an increasing focus on ethical investments, ESG investments. More and more investors are looking to invest in those products that are socially responsible, that are kind of demonstrating a forward-thinking approach. There's more legislation coming into play. So you will be familiar with the UK, Australia Modern Slavery Acts, increasing legislation in the US related to modern slavery, increasing legislation across Europe, across Asia. It seems to be that more and more countries are seeing this as a priority area. As a bank, it's really important to be ahead of the game when it comes to legislation, of course, to avoid any kind of reputational risk or financial damage. And as I mentioned before, demonstrating leadership, demonstrating that your organization takes this topic seriously is such an important part, not only for your own brand's reputational strengths, but also to inspire other banks within your industries to do the same. So finally, hopefully you are inspired to join the baseline assessment. Just to recap on the process. So once you sign up or volunteer to take part, we of course will put all of the necessary NDAs in place as needed. We work a lot with private sector companies across industries. We're very used to handling very sensitive information. We will provide you with a copy of the assessment questions and happy to have a call at any time to clarify any of the questions or answer any of your own questions back. You can complete the questionnaire in your own time. It usually takes maybe 3 or 4 weeks, given some kind of back and forth needed to answer some of the questions. And then once you're done, we will give you some comprehensive feedback. We'll highlight the areas, so the 5 areas that I just went through, we'll highlight which of those areas are kind of red, amber or green in terms of your response, in terms of your strategy, and where there might be improvements to be made. We'll make very specific, concrete recommendations. And if you so choose, this assessment can be taken on an annual basis, so you can actually track changes over time. And of course, we will have a follow-up call with you to discuss those results and to give you or discuss the support that your organization might need to operationalize them going forward. So that concludes the assessment process. I don't know if there were any questions that came in as I was talking.
With that, let's close the session today. Again, Matt and Phoebe, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye to everybody.
Bye. Bye.